Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wahid podcast. Today I have a very special guest in the studio. He is actually my professor. So I don't know if you guys know, but I went to Northwestern and got a journalism degree from there, and Professor Sam Meekings was my creative writing professor. So he knows all about my embarrassing poetry and on the beach and all my embarrassing writing endeavors, which, yeah, but let's not talk about that now. Let's talk about him. So, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited to have you here. So tell us a little bit about how you got to Qatar.
Well, okay. I mean, I got here, I think, in a pretty roundabout way. I finished university when I was your age, long time ago, and I had no idea what to do next. And I was living with a group of other students at the time, just getting ready for the final exams, and everyone had a plan, you know. One of my friends was going to go and do a graduate course, one had a job lined up, one was moving back home to be with family. And I thought, I've never thought further ahead than going to university. So I went to what was then the computer room. There was just one of them, where we looked on their careers website, and I saw there was this girl who'd been in the year above me who had been teaching in China and wanted to find more people to come and teach in China. And I thought, okay, that sounds like a interesting thing. So I wrote back an email and said, oh, tell me more. And she said, oh, it's fantastic, come. And a month later, I was getting on a plane to Beijing. And then, so over the next 7-8 years, I was, spending most of my time in China. I came back to the UK for a bit, did my master's, did a bit of studying, but was mostly traveling, and I kind of got used to the kind of expat life, if you like, the kind of exploring, traveling, living abroad. But it got to a point where I thought, okay, I've spent 6 years in China, I want to try somewhere new, and it just so happened that I saw a job advert in Qatar at the time, and I thought, okay, I'll apply and have a go, and I got the job, and I thought, okay, I'll give it a try, maybe just a year or two. But that was in 2010, and apart from a short break, I've been here ever since.
And do you like it here?
I do like it here, yeah, I feel pretty settled. I mean, I think there's a big feeling of shock when you first arrive. I think the first 6 months to a year are difficult, kind of getting used to the place and the way it works and the way everything is here. But I think after that, you either decide, okay, I'm going to stay, and you get used to it, or you kind of run away and never come back. And yeah, decided to stay.
I think there's like this trend here where people usually leave within 2 years, and if they stick after 2 years, then they're meant to be in Qatar.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you either kind of just dip your toes in and think, okay, that was a fun experiment, I'm off, or you stay and think, I'm going to give this a go, and I think the longer you stay, the more you get used to it, and the more you kind of find it difficult to think of life elsewhere. I know I go back to the UK most summers when we have the university break. And I'm always slightly shocked at how different things are there. And I always find myself thinking, well, that's not how things work back in Doha. So I think you get used to life here also. I mean, the hardest bit, though, is the bit you're kind of talking about, that there's this huge turnover of people, of friends, of people. So you're often making new friends and meeting new people. But that can be fun as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I agree with you. So, forgot to mention, but he's also a writer, and he has written The Book of Crows and Under Fishbone Clouds, and you have a new book coming up?
Yeah, that's right. New book coming up is called The Afterlives of Dr. Gogh. It's the story of an old man who was in one of Van Gogh's last paintings. So it's about his life and, as the title tells you, his afterlife. What happened to the painting, because it's a weird and unusual story up to its disappearance today. Yeah.
Wow, okay, so it's a historical fiction?
Yeah, most of what I do, as I think you know, is historical fiction. Under Fishbone Clouds and The Book of Crows, both based in China. Under Fishbone Clouds was about the last 60 years of Chinese history, and then The Book of Crows covers a lot of the last couple of hundred years of Chinese history. Having left China, I wanted to do something different. So yeah, this is historical fiction that kind of covers this man's life in France in kind of the 1830s to the 1880s when he meets Van Gogh, and Van Gogh sees him and thinks, wow, this guy has got such a sad face. He really kind of sums up the melancholy feeling of our age. And you know, Vincent van Gogh wasn't a particularly upbeat and happy guy himself. So for him to see this other man and think, well, he really sums up melancholy and depression, I thought, well, there must be a story here. What made him so sad? What made him so melancholy? What made this connection with Van Gogh? So I'm kind of tracing his life up to his meeting to see, where did this sadness come from? Where did this depression come from? And then also tracing this painting, because it had this kind of weird afterlife whereby it got confiscated by the Nazis as an example of degenerate art, but it got stolen, it got smuggled away to the US, it got sold later on for a record sum. It was in the papers for the most expensive painting ever sold.
Oh, wow.
But then it was bought by this Japanese paper magnate. He went bankrupt, he was about to get arrested when he died, and since then the painting's disappeared. So there are probably 2, 3, 4 people in the world who know where it is, but the rest of us have no clue. It hasn't been seen since the 1990s and could be anywhere.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I feel like I want to read it right now. When is it coming out?
So it should be available the end of this month. I'm going back to the UK, the last week of October to do a launch event and also to talk about it at my old university. So it'll be a nice trip. And it's being made into an audiobook at the moment, and that should be available start of January.
Awesome. Okay, so you guys know if you want to, read his book, end of October is when it's coming out. All right, so we got into your current life very quickly.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about, how did you get into writing and literature?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've always been interested in writing. I mean, I can't really remember a time when I wasn't kind of making up stories, either kind of, playing those imaginative games as a kid where you're kind of imagining you're somewhere else or someone else, and then kind of writing these little stories. When I was 7 or 8, maybe, I used to write stories about the pet dog we had at home. His name was Casper. And I used to kind of imagine him going on these adventures after we went to bed and doing all these things that were secret from the rest of the family. And I guess I just never stopped. I mean, I've always found it pleasurable. I mean, I write now also for, other people to read, but I think even if no one else read it, I'd still do it because I enjoy it. I enjoy that outlet, that kind of escape after, a day at work or a stressful, time in a traffic jam, kind of escaping into your imagination and a different world altogether.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. And, I mean, personally, I'm not able to get into that zone. I don't know why, and you know that I love writing because I've done journalism. I must love writing. So, but it's just very difficult sometimes when you get off work and you're so tired. You don't want to jump into something else, or you're going back home after a long day and you just want to go home and do something with your family and not write. So how do you motivate yourself to keep doing it every day?
Well, I think that's the key struggle that I think everyone faces. I mean, students especially.
Well, I'm glad you face it.
Everybody does, and I think that's because there are so many myths about writing, not just about writing, but any kind of creativity. Making art or music or film or whatever it might be, that people kind of grow up believing you have to be in this special, magical, inspired zone to be able to do it. And if you don't have that kind of magical, inspired feeling at that time, that kind of light bulb moment, then you just don't do it and you wait for that magical feeling to come. And I think the difference when you get serious about it is thinking, okay, well, I have to do this. I'm going to make myself do it, whether I feel in the mood or not. And I think, that's a hard step. But for me, what I have to do, and what I think I've partly learned to do, is switch off that self-critical voice in your head that, again, everybody has, where I just try and, sit down, usually for me, after my kids have gone to bed, sit down and try and write for an hour. And I don't read it back, I don't think about it, I don't worry and have that voice in my head saying, oh, this is rubbish, and why are you writing that? It's such a cliche, and oh, this is so boring, no one's going to want to read it. Because we all have that voice in our head. You just have to ignore it. And then later I kind of read that page or two back, and, you know, if I'm lucky, out of that page or two, there'll be a paragraph I can use, and if I'm not lucky, maybe there'll be a sentence I can take from that and ditch all the rest. But for me, you know, it's like cycling or swimming. It's keeping that activity going, and then reading it back later with that critical eye and thinking, okay, how can I make this nicer? How can I make this more beautiful? How can I make this more engaging, interesting, magical? But when I'm doing it, I try not to think of any of those things, because they just stop you. You know, they're those blocks where you think, oh, I can't do this, I'm not good enough, I'm never going to write something good today, so why bother?
Yeah.
You know, it's a question of turning that off, and I think it's just practice. It's just time that helps you do that.
So it gets better with practice.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, hopefully the writing gets better, but the switching off of the critical part of the brain gets easier, of just ignoring those kind of niggling self-doubts of that says, oh, this is rubbish, or why are you bothering, or what a waste of time. And you just have to kind of, push those to the side for a bit and push on regardless, and not think, okay, I've got to write something perfect each time, because I think even the best writers, the Nobel Prize winners, I don't think they're doing that either. I don't think they're writing the perfect sentence followed by the perfect sentence followed by the perfect sentence. I think they're doing the same thing. They're getting it out, and then later on they're coming back to it and polishing it and editing it and revising it and doing all the bits that no one really likes doing, you know, the painstaking bits, but you know, that bring it to the next level.
Yeah, well, that's a relief to hear. But like just staying on the same lines, you know, how did you convince yourself to get to this point? Like when you started, you know, there was a point you probably told yourself, okay, I'm going to get serious about this. And what were the practical things that you involved yourself in every day to, you know, keep at it when you started?
I mean, I think I was lucky in a sense that I started off in poetry. And when I was, you know, a university student, I'd be writing poetry. I studied history and English literature, so it was a lot of reading. And to kind of, you know, have a break from that, I'd jot very short poems, kind of haiku-length things. Later on, I did my master's in creative writing, and I only focused on poetry at that time. And I think if at that point I'd been trying to write, you know, a novel, 300 pages or, you know, 80,000 words, I probably would have faced a lot more of those I can't do it moments of, well, this is too much, or of, you know, that horrible feeling when you write 1,000, 10,000, 20,000 words and think, wait, this isn't going anywhere. With a poem, you know, you can write 5-6 lines or even 500-600 words, and then if it doesn't work and you have to abandon it, you don't feel too bad. You haven't had your soul destroyed. You can just pick up start another poem and start again. And it's a lot easier to read a lot of poems from a lot of different authors, whereas, of course, reading a lot of novels takes time. So I feel like that access, you know, being able to read a lot of contemporary writers and meet a lot of contemporary, you know, poets when I was studying, and to be able to write a lot in a lot of different forms and try out a lot of different, you know, poetic shapes and structures was really great kind of experimentation for me, so that it probably built my confidence up, so that when it got to the point of thinking, oh, I want to write something longer, I'd like to write this long story, and this long story turned into a novel, of thinking, okay, I can keep going, I can do it chapter by chapter in the same way that I did it poem by poem. So for me, that was the kind of easier way in, because it kind of offered that more opportunity for short experimentation rather than diving deep into, you know, something longer, a novella or a long short story that takes, you know, months or weeks of kind of dedication. Whereas you could spend a day alone with a poem, and, you know, if you're in the right zone and in the, you know, I used to go, when I studied my master's in Edinburgh, to the Scottish Poetry Library and sit there surrounded by books for a day, and often I'd come out with a poem, and there was such a great feeling of satisfaction about that, whether it was a good poem or a bad one. Certainly not all of those were good poems by any stretch of the imagination, but just the feeling of having created something was what kept me going.
Okay, awesome. So it is possible to have a full-time job and be able to write.
Yeah, it is
'Cause that's
possible.
what you do.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's a kind of struggle balancing everything sometimes. But yeah, I mean, fortunately with the job I have, being a university professor, it gives me a bit of time to write. And also, I think I'd feel guilty and a bit of a sham if I didn't, because, you know, I have my creative writing students, you know, like
Yeah.
you, and I'm kind of drilling them on, okay, today we're going to try this, and today we're going to try that, and we're going to do this bit of 5-minute writing and this bit of 10-minute writing. And I think if I were making students do something that I wasn't doing, I'd feel really guilty, and I'd feel a bit of a fake, really. And I think it's good for students also to know that the struggle isn't just at their level. You know, everyone struggles at every level, and you kind of have to keep pushing yourself to keep going, and it gets easier, but it's always kind of mad balancing act.
Yeah, well, I remember you used to always write with us whenever you give us assignments in class. You would be writing things, and it's like if a personal trainer didn't work out while she trained you to work out, and you can see that, and you're like, are you the right person for me? So yeah, I understand what you're saying. So yeah, let's get back to your historical fiction. That's something I'm really interested in. How did you get yourself to write about a different culture, a different person? You know, I mean, was that difficult? Historical fiction is a very difficult genre to get into.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think the easiest answer is to say I was younger, I was more naive, and I don't think I really realized the scope of what I was doing until I was deep into it, you know. And I thought, okay, yeah, I'll give it a shot and give it a try, and why not try and write about this thing. And it was only once I'd started writing and got into it that I thought, wow, I've set myself a really difficult challenge. But by then I'd started and I wanted to continue, so all the kind of research I did wasn't a chore. How it came about, my first book, Under Fishbone Clouds, I'd been in China for 3 or 4 years by that point. And I'd met a Chinese woman. I got engaged at that point to this Chinese woman, and I was sending these emails back home to my family all the time, telling them about China, telling them about my experiences there, telling them about the things that I'd learned. And it got to a point where I thought, I really want to share all of these things that are so different in China to the way things are back home. You know, all the little myths, all the little habits, all the little bits of folklore and all the stories. And at that same point, my fiance at the time, I was meeting her family, and they were telling me these stories. And the novel is based on her grandparents' story, their life story. This man and this woman who met, had an arranged marriage in the 1930s. At the time, Japan had invaded China. And it was about really the struggles they faced staying together with all the forces of history working against them. You know, there was a Japanese invasion. After that, there was the Communist Revolution. There was the Great Leap Forward, where everyone was, you know, sent off to factories. Everyone was, you know, melting down metal in their backyards and ignoring farming, which led to this huge famine that they had to endure. Then there was the Cultural Revolution, where people had to be re-educated. So both of them were sent off to different parts of the country to work on farms and to kind of learn the peasant life, because, you know, there was that kind of communist myth at the time of the noble peasant, and we should all be like them, and being bourgeois and reading books and being intellectuals is a bad thing, so we have to be re-educated to be peasants. So they were separated for almost 8 years, living in these farms in the countryside, and then coming back together in the 70s, kind of having to relearn who each of them were, and, you know, it changed a lot in that time. And then China opened up in the 1980s and, you know, became a little more like the rest of the world, though of course it's still its own thing. And I just thought that was a fascinating journey, and I said, oh, you know, it'd be great if other people knew about it. And they knew that I wrote a lot and I wrote poems. And they said, well, write this story, tell this story. Yeah, let other people know about it. So I thought, okay, that's a great gift. And I wanted to, not take that gift lightly, really, to do it. I felt a kind of responsibility to do it justice. So kind of as I was writing, I was going back to them, but I was also reading a lot. As I said, I studied history at university, and I've always enjoyed history books as much as fiction books. So it was kind of fun to throw in those details of life in the 1930s or the 1950s. And for me to find out, a lot more about what happened in China during the kind of Great Famine, during the Great Leap Forward, during the Cultural Revolution. And I kind of was amazed that people lived through that, and to think about, okay, what must it have been like going through that day to day. So I found it a really kind of interesting experience. But I mean, my takeaway from historical fiction really is always that to start from the position that people are basically the same. You and I and everyone around us share more similarities than we have differences. But often those differences come from the particular place and time we were born. Those are the interesting historical fiction bits, our culture and our beliefs and our societies we're in. But deep down we have the same worries and the same desires and the same longings and the same conflicts. But how do they play out in these different situations? That's what interests me.
Okay, wow. That was... sounds really overwhelming to have all of that information and have to, do justice to it. And it sounds amazing, honestly.
Well, I think, for me, it's easy. I mean, I think especially these days when we're really used to news stories where we hear about however many people are being killed in Syria or how many refugees may have, drowned. And there gets to a point where no matter how much you care about these issues, you kind of switch off a bit because you can't imagine 1,000 people dying in this, battle, or these 10,000 people dying in this famine, or 100,000 people being displaced. These numbers become too much to kind of understand and to empathize with. And for me, I think it's when you zoom in on one or two people's personal experience of these things, definitely, that you can kind of understand it more and understand that experience of, those people in these war zones or in these famines or these refugees, fleeing for their lives. You can see it through the individual stories. And for me, that was the interesting bit about the novel I wrote as well, seeing this, kind of epic sweep of Chinese history where they had so many revolutions, if you like, so many changes to day-to-day life. The interesting way to see it for me was not what's happening to the whole country, but how does it affect these two people, this man and this woman, who are just like you and me. Yeah,
I agree. We often tend to get really desensitized, and it's not until you, like personally, as in journalism, again, going and meeting those people, talking to them, is when I realized that it's about human beings and not just an issue in general, that we like to throw out numbers and spout numbers, and eventually you just don't want to read about this anymore. You're so disconnected, and you're so tired of reading about this, and then after a few months I have to remind myself that I need to care about it again, so I totally understand that.
Sometimes you see numbers and you kind of forget those numbers are all people. They're just figures on a page.
Definitely. Yeah, true. So how has the reception been for your kind of writing, for your kind of work, and just in general your books?
I mean, it varies. I mean, I also wrote, before either of those novels, I wrote a poetry book, and the reception for that was okay. I mean, it was quiet in the sense that poetry doesn't have a huge readership, but it got a few interesting reviews, and I got some poems in some anthologies in England. But I think poetry scenes are very localized, really. So that was small. So it was a kind of shock when I wrote Under Fishbone Clouds and that came out, that it kind of expanded a little bit, and it was nice to see that people were interested in that story. I mean, it came out in the UK, and then later it got picked up and published in the US. So it did a kind of different edition with all the different American spellings and a different cover. Then later it got translated into Portuguese for Brazil.
Wow.
So the reception to that was really good.
Wow.
I think the Book of Crows was a little more experimental as a book. It's a novel which covers 4 different time periods. One 2,000 years ago at the time of the first Chinese emperor. One about 1,000 years ago with 2 Italian monks following the Silk Road Trail to meet Kublai Khan in the Chinese capital at the time. One taking place relatively recently in the 1980s, and one taking place in the Tang Dynasty, a famous poet. So with these 4 kind of very different time settings and different styles, I was trying different voices and how they connect, because all those 4 main characters at these different time periods are looking for this mythical Book of Crows, which is, you know, a mythical book that tells supposedly the whole past and present and future history of the world. And they're all kind of obsessed with this idea of finding out what the future will bring, of kind of being in control of their own fate and destiny. And yeah, I think that was a little less accessible than, you know, following a couple, but it was, you know, great fun for me to write. And, you know, I was very happy with the reviews I got, you know, in a few newspapers and magazines, and with kind of readers' responses to it. But I think it got a slightly smaller readership than the first one, certainly.
So, like, when I read reviews on Goodreads, or especially for historical fiction, I think the people most hurt by what's written is the people whose culture is being written about. Has that happened with you? Like, how? I mean, I don't know if you found many Chinese reading your books and what they thought about it.
Yeah, I have had a couple. I've only heard mostly positive things.
Okay.
I mean, I think this issue of cultural appropriation, really, is what we're talking about, has come to a head, you know, especially in the literary world in the last couple of years. And there's been kind of controversy about, you know, how much can you and how much should you write about people and culture outside of your own? How much can you know of this? I mean, my feeling is you can do it. I think, and I think to a certain degree you should do it, but there's a difference between doing it recklessly and doing it responsibly. And I think the difference is in kind of purpose and motivation. You know, my goal with that first book, telling this couple's story, you know, I had the blessing of the people whose story it was to tell it. And they were saying, you know, we're never going to write about this. We don't write, or we're not interested. You share it. And they were very happy that I'd done that. And the, you know, Chinese people I met who'd read that were very positive that I'd kind of written about that time and followed, you know, that kind of individual story through it, rather than commenting on it politically and saying, oh, isn't communism bad, or oh, wasn't it better when it opened up, or isn't, you know, Chairman Mao a terrible person. There was none of that kind of political bit. I just followed the kind of individual domestic stories, and they said, you know, that's seems like a nice angle with which to look at it, to share that thing. I think, you know, if you're taking someone else's culture and you're using it purely for profit, and you're taking marginalized people and saying, you know, I can tell their story better than them, then that's problematic. But I think if you're within that culture, as I was at the time, living in China, and, you know, marrying a Chinese woman, having, you know, Eurasian children who have this Chinese heritage, I, you know, as much as anything, I kind of wrote it for them, wanting to share their history, their heritage with them. So, I mean, predictably, I don't think I culturally appropriated, but I think it's a question of motive, really, of what you're going to do with this material. But also, I think it can be a great and a positive thing to step out of your own mind and to put yourself in the mind of people in different places and different times and different cultures. You know, whether I'm writing about Chinese people 100 years ago, or whether I'm writing in the present day from a female point of view. I think that's a great way into thinking about the
Definitely,
struggles other people go through.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and the way they see the world.
And I've definitely found sometimes that I've read books where people have written about a different culture or a different gender. Like I remember Thousand Splendid Suns by Khalid Hosseini. He wrote
Yes.
from a woman's perspective, and it was so beautiful and so, I don't know, just so inspiring to read. So I agree. It really just depends on, you know, the person who's writing it in the first place, what their motive is, and, you know.
Yeah, and I think
How
it's,
deep.
I'd like to think it's quite easy to spot the kind of positive motivations, which is sharing, you know, and
Yeah.
empathizing, and the kind of negative motivations, which are, oh, this is a hot topic and I'm going to
Yeah.
write about this and get in the news and make money
Yeah.
out of this and grab some headlines
Yeah.
and become kind of notorious or controversial, which, you know, people
Yeah.
want sometimes. I think sometimes, yeah, that's easy to spot.
Yeah, but then again, it's really difficult because it's cultural appropriation is such a hot topic, like you said. And almost everybody wants to blame somebody for cultural appropriation. Sometimes it's very valid, and sometimes it's just, you know, you just want to learn about something and you just want to share that what your experiences about something have been. So
Well, and I think it's also a topic that's debated differently in different countries. I mean, I think, you know, I pay most attention, obviously, to the kind of UK press of all the foreign presses, because I'm paying attention to what's going on back home. And I think living, as people do in the UK, where there are, I think the cultural appropriation debate goes hand in hand with the kind of multicultural debate. Okay, we're living now in cities and societies where there's this pluralism of culture, of religion, of language, increasingly, of background, of beliefs, of ideas, and people are thinking, well, how do we coexist? How do we get along?
Yeah.
And I think that is when people get sensitive to, you know, my culture is being treated negatively, or people are taking it and using it in a particular way. In China, you don't see too much of these debates about cultural appropriation. I think because, you know, having just opened up to the rest of the world in the kind of 1980s, there's and I'm generalizing here and talking about the people I met and the students I met, but certainly, the young people and the students I met were really wanting to share and try out new things, and open to the idea of taking them and you know, trying them out from a different angle, and, you know, trying out, you know, Chinese hip hop or Chinese reggae or whatever it might be, rather than thinking, okay, well, are people stealing from us? What are we stealing from them? I think there's a difference, and everyone hopefully can see that difference between stealing and, you know, sharing. And the difference is, one is a kind of dialogue, you know, when you're sharing something, there's a back and forth and you're communicating with the people within that culture, and one is just you dipping in, grabbing something and running away without talking to anyone in that culture. If I'd never been to China and never spoke to any Chinese people, I would never want to
you would be an Orientalist.
From that. Yeah, exactly. I'd never want to write about that, because it would just be from a different perspective altogether.
Definitely,
Yeah.
And I've had that experience as well, where I went to do a journalism project in Malaysia with a classmate of mine, and we wrote about refugees and the treatment of refugees in the country. And yes, Malaysia accepts refugees, but there are a lot of issues that could be dealt with. But some of the Malaysians that, when they read the story, a lot of them actually really appreciated the fact that we were talking about this. But some of them were saying things like, well, you don't live here, you've never lived here, you just came here for a journalism project, you know. And we're upset about it. And they said, well, at least we do this, you know, talk about the positives that we do. And it's difficult to deal with that. But then again, I told myself that it was the people who I wrote about and what they thought about it, and if that they appreciated the fact that I shared their stories, then it's good.
Yeah, and I think any time you share something that is maybe not 100% positive, it makes people defensive, and they want to say, well, look at the good thing, you know. And that, you know, happens everywhere. I think you've got to take it with a pinch of salt, really. But that's life, the positive and the negative together. Yeah,
definitely. Well, we've had a great discussion. So I want to ask you, what are your future plans?
Well, right now, obviously, besides teaching and the full-time job, promoting this new novel, The Afterlives of Dr. Geshe, and then, working on the next one. I've always got a project.
You have an idea already?
I have an idea. I've been planning it out. Yeah, this is one that's going to be set back in the
historical
UK.
Fiction again.
A little bit of historical fiction, but over the last kind of 30, 40 years. But a lot of people ask me, when are you going to write it about Qatar? Which is a good question. I haven't got there yet. I think it takes a few years for the ideas to drop down. I've always got an idea in the back of my head, and the exciting bit is seeing, can I make it come alive or not? So very soon I'll start experimenting and see if I can bring that to life or not.
Awesome. So where do people reach out to you for anything, for updates, social media? Do you want to share?
Yeah, sure. Usually my Twitter at @SMeekings, or I have my website which has all the details of my books and videos and interviews and all those things, which is www.sammeekings.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on our show. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy you were here. Thank you. And thank you guys for listening. I hope you have a great week and see you in the next episode.